In the quiet suburbs of Toronto and Vancouver, families gather around dinner tables, unaware that the foundations of their financial security are cracking. As we approach the end of 2025, Canada's housing market casts a long, ominous shadow over the nation's economy. Home prices, which soared to unprecedented heights during the low-interest era of the early 2020s, now teeter on the edge of instability. Household debt has reached staggering levels, with the debt-to-disposable income ratio holding steady at 181.8% in the second quarter of this year, a figure that leaves little room for error in an uncertain world. Consider the numbers. Over 1.2 million mortgages are set to renew in 2025 alone, totaling more than $300 billion in debt. Many of these were locked in at rates as low as 1–2% back in 2020–2021. Now, with the Bank of Canada's overnight rate at 2.25% and fixed renewal rates climbing toward 5–7%, homeowners face a payment shock that could increase monthly bills by thousands. Unemployment stands at 6.9%, projected to peak at 7.3% by year's end, amplifying the strain on middle-class families already stretched thin. This isn't mere speculation. Mortgage delinquency rates have risen to 0.22% nationally, with Ontario hitting 0.23%, a 44% jump year over year. In Toronto, it's even higher at 0.24%. These early warning signs echo the fragility seen in past crises, where over-leveraged households became the first victims. As we delve deeper, we'll uncover how this bubble formed, the forces threatening to burst it, and what it means for everyday Canadians grappling with the fear of losing their homes. The storm is gathering, and the question lingers: is Canada prepared for what's coming?
The warning signs are no longer subtle. Across Canada's major cities, the data paints a troubling picture. In Vancouver, average home prices peaked above $1.3 million in 2022 and have since declined by roughly 15–20% in real terms when adjusted for inflation. Toronto follows a similar trajectory. Prices have fallen about 18% from their 2022 highs, yet remain stubbornly high relative to incomes. The price-to-income ratio in Toronto now stands at approximately 10.5, among the highest in the developed world. Meanwhile, the Bank of Canada's aggressive rate hikes from 2022 to 2024 pushed the 5-year fixed mortgage rate from under 2% to over 5.5% at its peak. Even as the central bank began cutting rates in mid-2025, the damage had been done. Many homeowners who renewed early in 2025 saw their monthly payments jump by 30–60%. A family with an $800,000 mortgage renewed at 1.9% in 2020 now faces payments of roughly $4,800 per month at 5.5%, compared to $3,000 before renewal. Mortgage delinquency rates, though still relatively low at 0.22% nationally, are climbing fastest in the regions hit hardest by the downturn: Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta. In Ontario, delinquencies rose 44% year over year in the first half of 2025. More alarming is the sharp increase in serious delinquencies, those over 90 days past due, which have doubled in some urban markets. These numbers are not isolated. They reflect a broader pattern: households carrying debt loads that leave almost no buffer. The average Canadian household now owes nearly $2.10 for every dollar of disposable income. That ratio, hovering around 181–182%, is among the highest in the G7. When the next wave of renewals arrives in 2026, estimated at $400 billion in mortgage debt, the pressure will intensify. The cracks are already visible. The question is how deep they will run.
At the heart of this impending shock lies a classic economic mechanism: the interplay between low interest rates, speculative borrowing, and asset price inflation. For years, the Bank of Canada's near-zero rates post-2020 fueled a borrowing frenzy. Households piled on debt, pushing home prices skyward. In Toronto and Vancouver, price-to-income ratios ballooned to 10–12 times median earnings. Vancouver at 92.7% of household income for ownership costs, Toronto at 68.3%. This created a bubble where values detached from fundamentals like wages and rents. Now the reversal hits. With rates holding at 2.25%, renewals expose the vulnerability. A typical $500,000 mortgage from 2020 at 1.5% renews at 4.5%, spiking payments by $400–600 monthly. For over-leveraged families, this erodes disposable income, already strained by a debt-to-income ratio of 174.9%. When payments consume 50–60% of take-home pay, defaults rise. The cascade follows. Delinquencies, now at 0.21% nationally, trigger forced sales. Oversupply depresses prices, leading to negative equity, where homes are worth less than mortgages. Banks face liquidity squeezes as non-performing loans mount, tightening credit further. Unemployment at 6.9% and projected to 7.1% by late 2025 amplifies this, as job losses strip ability to pay. This feedback loop mirrors how small triggers unravel overinflated markets, turning personal debt into systemic risk. The mechanics are unforgiving. What rose on cheap money falls on its scarcity.
To understand the peril facing Canada, we must look to history's harsh lessons. The U.S. housing crash of 2008 offers a stark parallel. There, subprime mortgages fueled a bubble where home prices rose 80% from 2000 to 2006, detached from incomes. When rates climbed from 1% to 5.25% by 2006, delinquencies surged to 5% by 2008, triggering foreclosures that flooded the market. Prices plummeted 30–50% in hotspots like Las Vegas and Miami, wiping out $7 trillion in household wealth. Unemployment spiked to 10% and GDP contracted 4.3%. Banks like Lehman Brothers collapsed under toxic assets, leading to a global recession. Greece's debt crisis of 2010 echoes Canada's high household leverage. With public debt at 146% of GDP by 2010, austerity measures crushed growth. But household debt, at 120% of disposable income, amplified the pain. Unemployment hit 27.9%, evictions rose, and suicides increased 35%. Argentina's 2022 inflation nightmare, peaking at 211%, shows how currency devaluation erodes savings. The peso lost 95% value against the dollar, while Turkey's lira plunged 80% from 2018 to 2023 amid 85% inflation, forcing rate hikes to 50% and sparking defaults. Closer to home, Canada's 1989–1990 real estate bubble burst when rates hit 14%. Toronto prices fell 25–30%, delinquencies tripled to 1.5%, and bankruptcies soared 50%. Unemployment reached 11.4%, with GDP shrinking 2.9%. These cases reveal a pattern. Over-indebtedness meets rising rates, igniting chain reactions from personal ruin to systemic failure. Canada's current metrics, debt at 181% of disposable income, prices 10 times incomes, mirror these precursors. The bubble's burst isn't inevitable, but the shadows of the past warn of its potential fury.
The ripple effects of this housing fragility extend far beyond individual households, threatening the broader Canadian economy. Real estate and related activities account for roughly 12–13% of GDP, with construction, renovations, and transactions fueling jobs and growth. As prices soften, Toronto's benchmark down to around $956,800 in recent months, Vancouver's at $1,123,700 with annual declines, wealth effects diminish. Homeowners feeling poorer cut spending on durable goods, travel, and services, dragging consumer demand. Bank lending tightens as well, with household debt at 176.7% of disposable income in Q3 2025, the equivalent of $1.77 owed for every dollar earned. Banks grow cautious. Non-performing loans, though low, edge up, constraining credit availability. Unemployment, recently falling to 6.5% in November, masks vulnerabilities. Any slowdown could reverse gains, hitting variable rate borrowers hardest. The Bank of Canada's rate at 2.25% offers limited relief for renewals. Over 60% of outstanding mortgages renew by end 2026, with many facing higher payments despite cuts. This debt overhang risks a vicious cycle. Forced sales increase inventory, further pressuring prices, eroding equity, and amplifying defaults. In a worst-case scenario, a 20–30% price correction could shave trillions from household net worth, mirroring 2008's U.S. contagion, but centered on domestic leverage. Canada's economy, resilient so far, stands at a precipice where housing weakness could tip it into prolonged stagnation. The interconnected risks demand vigilance.
As the Bank of Canada holds its policy rate steady at 2.25% through December 2025, the government's response has centered on cautious monitoring rather than aggressive intervention. The central bank has emphasized resilience in the face of global trade uncertainties, noting that economic slack and moderating inflation allow for a neutral stance. Yet for households, this stability offers limited relief. With over 60% of outstanding mortgages set to renew by the end of 2026, including more than 1.2 million in 2025 alone, many face the reality of higher payments despite recent rate cuts. Federal measures such as extended amortizations for first-time buyers and insured mortgages aim to ease entry into the market, but do little for existing homeowners grappling with renewals. Provincial initiatives in Ontario and British Columbia have focused on increasing supply through zoning reforms, yet construction lags persist amid higher borrowing costs for developers. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has tightened stress tests and monitoring of non-performing loans, but delinquency rates, while dipping slightly to 0.22% nationally in mid-2025, continue to rise in stressed regions like Ontario at 0.23%. Critics argue that earlier stimulus during low-rate years inflated the bubble, and now fiscal constraints limit bold action. The government's Housing Accelerator Fund targets new builds, but analysts warn it may not offset the drag from renewal shocks. As unemployment fell to 6.5% in November, signaling some labor market improvement, policymakers remain vigilant. The approach is one of restraint, avoiding actions that could reignite inflation while acknowledging the vulnerability of over-leveraged households. This delicate balance leaves many Canadians to navigate the fallout largely on their own.
Amid this uncertainty, the human cost emerges in quiet, everyday struggles. In Toronto suburbs, families like the Thompsons, middle-class professionals with 2 children, face renewal next spring. Their $750,000 mortgage, taken at 1.8% in 2020, now confronts rates near 4.5%. Monthly payments could rise by $800, consuming over 45% of their take-home income. Already cutting vacations and extracurriculars, they worry about dipping into retirement savings. Across the country, similar stories unfold. In Vancouver, a teacher in her 50s sees her condo payment jump, forcing delays in helping aging parents. Delinquency rates, though dipping nationally to 0.22% in mid-2025, remain elevated in Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%. Unemployment's recent drop to 6.5% in November offers hope, but many in trade-exposed sectors fear job loss amid global tensions. Household debt stands at 176.7% of disposable income in Q3 2025, $1.77 owed for every dollar earned. For middle-class households, this leverage turns renewal shock into existential threat, potential bankruptcy, forced sales, or chronic stress eroding mental health. Studies link financial strain to higher anxiety and family breakdown. As prices in Toronto hover around $956,800 benchmark and Vancouver at $1,123,700, still far above incomes, the dream of homeownership risks becoming a burden. These personal crises underscore the bubble's fragility, not just numbers, but lives hanging in the balance. For individuals facing this precarious landscape, practical strategies can provide a measure of control. First, assess your current financial position thoroughly. Calculate your debt-to-disposable income ratio, currently at 176.7% nationally in Q3 2025, and determine how much buffer you have for increased payments. With the Bank of Canada holding its policy rate at 2.25% as of December 2025, renewal rates for 5-year fixed mortgages hover around 4 to 5%, meaning many renewing in 2026 could see payments rise 15 to 20% from pre-2022 levels. Build an emergency fund covering at least 6 months of expenses, prioritizing high-interest debt reduction. Consider extending amortization periods if qualifying, up to 30 years for insured mortgages to lower monthly burdens, though this increases total interest paid. Switching to a variable rate mortgage might offer short-term relief if further cuts materialize, but carries risk if rates rebound. Refinancing to consolidate debts or access equity can help, provided home values hold. Toronto's benchmark price sits around $951,700 in late 2025, down from peaks but still elevated. Consult independent financial advisors early, shopping multiple lenders 6 months before renewal. Stress test your budget against a 20–30% payment hike. Unemployment at 6.5% in November signals improving labor conditions, yet job security remains key. Diversify income sources where possible. These steps won't eliminate the shock, but they can mitigate its severity, preserving equity and stability amid the gathering pressures. Preparation turns vulnerability into resilience.
As the Bank of Canada maintains its policy rate at 2.25% through December 2025, the path forward remains fraught with uncertainty. The central bank's decision reflects a fragile equilibrium. Economic growth surprised upward in Q3 with 2.6% GDP expansion, yet trade tensions and structural adjustments loom large. Unemployment's drop to 6.5% in November signals labor market improvement, but household debt continues its climb, reaching 176.7% of disposable income in Q3, the equivalent of $1.77 owed for every dollar earned. Mortgage delinquency rates at 0.22% nationally in mid-2025 show regional strains, with Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%. Home prices persist in softening. Toronto's benchmark around $951,700, Vancouver's at $1,123,700, both down from peaks yet elevated against incomes. With over 60% of outstanding mortgages renewing by end 2026, including more than 1.2 million in 2025, the renewal wave tests resilience. These figures underscore a deeper vulnerability, a market built on low rates now confronting higher costs amid global headwinds. The shadow lengthens not just over balance sheets, but over the stability many Canadians have long taken for granted. Vigilance is required, for the bubble's fate hangs on threads of policy, employment, and confidence.
The signs of strain are deepening as we move through late 2025. Household debt has climbed to 176.7% of disposable income in the third quarter, the highest in recent quarters, meaning Canadians now owe $1.77 for every dollar earned after taxes. This persistent rise, driven by slower income growth outpaced by borrowing, leaves families with thinner margins against shocks. Mortgage delinquency rates remain low nationally at around 0.22%, but regional pressures persist. Ontario at 0.23%, with Toronto at 0.24%. These figures, while improved slightly in some areas, highlight ongoing vulnerabilities in high-cost markets. The Bank of Canada's policy rate holds firm at 2.25% as of December, reflecting a cautious stance amid resilient global conditions and domestic slack. Home prices continue to reflect cooling demand. Toronto's benchmark stands near $951,700, down from earlier peaks, while Vancouver's hovers around $1,123,700, still elevated but showing annual declines. With over 60% of outstanding mortgages renewing by the end of 2026, including more than 1.2 million in 2025, the renewal pressures mount against this backdrop. GDP surprised with 2.6% annualized growth in Q3, yet underlying domestic demand remains flat, underscoring the fragility beneath the surface numbers. The looming shadow grows heavier, as personal leverage meets an economy navigating uncertain waters.
As 2025 draws to a close, the housing market's trajectory offers little reassurance. Household debt has reached 176.7% of disposable income in the third quarter, the equivalent of $1.77 owed for every dollar earned, marking the fourth straight quarterly rise as borrowing outpaces income growth. This entrenched leverage, with total credit market debt nearing $3.2 trillion, underscores the precarious position of many families. Mortgage delinquency rates, though subdued nationally at around 0.22% in mid-2025, reveal persistent regional strains, Ontario at 0.23%, Toronto at 0.24%. The Bank of Canada's policy rate remains anchored at 2.25% following the December decision, a level deemed appropriate amid resilient global conditions and domestic economic slack. Home prices reflect ongoing adjustment, with Toronto's benchmark near $951,700 and Vancouver's at $1,123,700, both down from prior highs, yet detached from wage growth. With approximately 60% of outstanding mortgages renewing by the end of 2026,
including over 1.2 million in 2025. The pressures compound. Third quarter GDP expanded at an annualized 2.6%, buoyed by trade dynamics, yet final domestic demand stayed flat, signaling subdued underlying momentum. Unemployment's decline to 6.5% in November provides some relief, but the renewal horizon tests the limits of household endurance. The looming shadow persists, a reminder that stability remains fragile in the face of accumulated vulnerabilities. The mechanics of the coming shock are now locked in motion. Between 2025 and 2026, roughly 2.4 million Canadian mortgages, representing more than $675 billion in outstanding principal, will reach the end of their term. The majority were originated between 2020 and 2022 at fixed rates below 2.5%. Current 5-year fixed renewal rates sit between 4.4% and 5.1%, depending on lender and credit profile. For a typical $700,000 mortgage taken in 2021 at 1.84% with 25-year amortization, the monthly payment was approximately $2,900. Renewing today at 4.79% on the same remaining amortization pushes that payment to $4,020, an increase of $1,120 per month, or nearly 39%. For households already allocating 45 to 55% of gross income to shelter costs, this single event consumes most remaining discretionary income. The Bank of Canada's own stress testing scenarios, published in its May 2025 Financial System Review, estimated that a 30% rise in payments could push the severe delinquency rate, 90-plus days, from 0.15% to as high as 1.1% by late 2027 if unemployment rises only modestly to 8%. In a more adverse scenario, combining job losses and a 20% price correction, the central bank warned of delinquency rates approaching levels last seen in the early 1990s recession. These are not fringe projections. They are the central bank's baseline contingency plans. The fuse is burning, and the length is now measurable in months, not years.
The comparison with past crises sharpens the focus on Canada's unique vulnerabilities. In the United States during 2008, household debt peaked at around 130% of disposable income, yet the subprime meltdown triggered a cascade. Delinquency rates soared to 10%, prices fell 30% nationally, and unemployment hit 10%. Canada's current debt-to-disposable income ratio at 176.7% in Q3 2025, $1.77 owed for every dollar earned, exceeds those levels, with total household credit market debt nearing $3.2 trillion. Greece's ordeal saw household debt around 120% amid public fiscal collapse, leading to 27% unemployment and widespread evictions. Argentina and Turkey highlight currency-driven pain, but Canada's fixed-rate dominance delays the shock until renewal. The 1989-1990 Canadian bubble burst under 14% rates saw Toronto prices drop 30%, delinquencies triple, and recession deepen. Today, with the Bank of Canada policy rate steady at 2.25% in December 2025, renewal rates around 4.5% still elevate payments. Delinquency rates remain subdued nationally at 0.22% in mid-2025, with Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%. Unemployment's fall to 6.5% in November offers breathing room, yet the scale of leverage, combined with softening prices, Toronto benchmark near $951,700 and Vancouver at $1,123,700, positions Canada for amplified fallout if triggers align. History teaches that high debt loads rarely unwind gently. The parallels are unmistakable, the differences in timing and structure no less foreboding. The broader economic implications of a housing downturn cannot be overstated. Housing-related activities contribute approximately 12 to 15% to Canada's GDP through construction, real estate services, and consumer spending tied to home equity. As benchmark prices in Toronto hover near $951,700, down significantly from 2022 peaks, and Vancouver is at $1,123,700, with ongoing annual declines, the wealth effect erodes confidence. Homeowners perceiving diminished net worth curtail expenditures on big-ticket items, from appliances to vehicles, slowing retail and manufacturing sectors. Credit conditions tighten in response. with household debt at 176.7% of disposable income in Q3 2025, $1.77 owed per dollar earned. Banks exercise caution, elevating borrowing standards. Delinquency rates nationally at 0.22% in mid-2025, with Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%, signal early stress that could constrain liquidity if defaults accelerate. The Bank of Canada's policy rate, held at 2.25% in December 2025, provides scant cushion for the renewal of over 60% of outstanding mortgages by end 2026, including more than 1.2 million in 2025 alone. Unemployment's decline to 6.5% in November offers temporary respite, yet vulnerabilities persist amid trade uncertainties. Q3 GDP's surprising 2.6% annualized growth, driven largely by net exports rather than robust domestic demand, masks underlying fragility. A sustained housing correction risks tipping this balance, amplifying job losses in construction and finance, and potentially dragging the economy into deeper stagnation. The interconnections are profound. Personal debt burdens translate into macroeconomic headwinds, threatening the stability many have long assumed.
The government's response, while measured, reveals the limits of policy in confronting entrenched vulnerabilities. The Bank of Canada, in its December 2025 decision, maintained the policy rate at 2.25%, citing resilient global conditions, easing inflation, and excess supply in the economy. Governor Tiff Macklem emphasized that the current stance supports softening labor markets while guarding against renewed price pressures. Yet this neutrality offers cold comfort to households facing renewal. Federal initiatives, including the First Home Savings Account and extended amortization options for insured mortgages, target new buyers but provide scant relief for the millions renewing existing debt. Provincial efforts in British Columbia and Ontario to streamline approvals and boost supply have added thousands of planned units, but high financing costs for developers slow actual construction. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation reports insured mortgage delinquencies remaining low, yet uninsured segments show rising stress. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions continues enhanced monitoring of lending practices, but critics note that earlier macroprudential measures, stress tests introduced in 2018, failed to prevent the debt buildup to 176.7% of disposable income in Q3 2025. Fiscal space is constrained by elevated deficits, limiting scope for direct household support. Policymakers appear caught between preventing moral hazard and averting widespread distress. In the absence of bold intervention, the burden falls heavily on individuals already stretched by $1.77 in debt for every dollar of after-tax income. The response, deliberate and restrained, underscores how difficult it is to unwind imbalances built over years of easy money. The stories emerging from Canadian households paint a picture of quiet desperation. In Mississauga, a software engineer in his 40s renewed his mortgage in early 2025. What was once a manageable $3,200 monthly payment on an $850,000 loan jumped to $4,700. To cover the difference, he canceled his children's sports programs, postponed vehicle repairs, and began working weekend shifts. His family now eats out less, shops only on sale, and has deferred plans to replace an aging roof. In Calgary, an oil sector couple saw their variable rate mortgage payments rise steadily before switching to fixed in mid-2025, locking in a rate that still added $900 monthly. They drained their emergency savings and took on credit card debt at 20% interest to bridge the gap. Across British Columbia, teachers and nurses report skipping prescription refills or dental care to meet housing costs. Mental health referrals linked to financial stress have risen noticeably in urban clinics. These are not isolated cases. With household debt at 176.7% of disposable income in Q3 2025, $1.77 owed for every after-tax dollar, millions sit one job loss or medical emergency from crisis. Delinquency rates remain contained nationally at 0.22%, but the human toll precedes the statistics: fractured sleep, strained marriages, postponed retirements. The middle class, long anchored by home equity, now confronts the possibility that the largest investment of their lives could become their greatest liability. The renewal shock is not merely financial, it is reshaping lives in ways that no policy rate decision can fully capture.
For Canadians navigating this terrain, proactive steps remain the most reliable defense. Begin by requesting renewal quotes from multiple lenders 4 to 6 months in advance. Competition can shave 0.25 to 0.5% off offered rates, translating to thousands saved over 5 years. With the Bank of Canada policy rate steady at 2.25% in December 2025, 5-year fixed rates cluster between 4.4% and 5.1%. Even small differences matter. Explore all available options. Extending amortization to 30 years on uninsured mortgages can reduce monthly payments by 10 to 15%, though it increases lifetime interest. Consolidating high-interest credit card or line of credit debt into the mortgage at renewal locks in lower rates, provided equity allows. If employment feels secure and further rate cuts seem likely, a variable rate product could save money short-term, but only with a clear tolerance for fluctuations. Prioritize building or preserving liquidity. Aim for an emergency fund covering 6 to 12 months of essential expenses, held in high-interest savings or guaranteed investment certificates. Cut discretionary spending ruthlessly now. Track every dollar for 3 months to identify leaks. Side income through freelancing, renting a room, or part-time work can bridge gaps without touching retirement savings. Finally, seek professional guidance early. Fee-only financial planners or accredited credit counselors can model scenarios using current delinquency trends, national 0.22%, Ontario 0.23%, and price levels, Toronto benchmark near $951,700. Preparation does not guarantee immunity, but it markedly improves odds of weathering the storm intact. Action taken today shapes outcomes tomorrow.
The year 2025 ends with the housing bubble still intact, yet visibly strained. Household debt has solidified at 17.6% of disposable income through the third quarter, the highest level in recent memory, translating to $1.77 owed for every dollar of after-tax earnings. Total household credit market debt approaches $3.2 trillion, a figure that towers over wage growth and productivity gains of the past decade. Mortgage delinquency rates hold near 0.22% nationally, as reported in mid-2025 data, with Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%. Modest on the surface, yet representing the sharpest year-over-year increases since the pandemic. The Bank of Canada's policy rate remains unchanged at 2.25% following the December decision, a level intended to balance lingering inflationary risks against growing economic slack. Benchmark home prices linger in adjustment. Toronto near $951,700, Vancouver around $1,123,700, both materially lower than 2022 peaks, but still among the least affordable in the developed world when measured against median incomes. Unemployment's encouraging drop to 6.5% in November provides a counterweight, yet the labor market's gains feel precarious amid global trade frictions and domestic restructuring. With the bulk of the 2025-2026 renewal wave still ahead, over 60% of outstanding mortgages resetting terms by the close of next year, the economy stands at an inflection point. The shadow cast by the housing market has lengthened, not dissipated. What begins as individual hardship has the clear potential to broaden into something far more systemic. The question is no longer whether pressure is building, but how forcefully it will eventually release.
As we stand on the threshold of 2026, the housing bubble endures, yet its contours reveal deepening fissures. Household debt has entrenched itself at 176.7% of disposable income through the third quarter of 2025, $1.77 owed for every dollar of after-tax earnings, with total credit market debt approaching $3.2 trillion. This persistent elevation, as debt accumulation continues to outpace modest income gains, leaves households with diminishing resilience against further shocks. Mortgage delinquency rates, nationally around 0.22% in recent quarters, mask regional divergences, Ontario at 0.23%, Toronto at 0.24%. The Bank of Canada's policy rate, held steady at 2.25% following the December decision, reflects a calibrated pause amid resilient global conditions and domestic slack. Benchmark home prices show ongoing adjustment, with Toronto near $951,700 and Vancouver at $1,123,700, both materially off their peaks, yet still far removed from median wage levels. Unemployment's decline to 6.5% in November marks a welcome turnaround, the lowest in 16 months, bolstered by unexpected job gains.
third quarter GDP surged 2.6% annualized, driven by trade dynamics despite flat domestic demand. Yet with over 60% of outstanding mortgages renewing by the end of 2026, including more than 1.2 million in 2025, the renewal pressures remain acute. The shadow looms not as an immediate cataclysm, but as a protracted strain on household finances and economic momentum. Vigilance is essential, for the path ahead tests the limits of endurance built on years of leverage.
The looming shadow over Canada's housing market has not lifted as 2025 ends. Household debt remains entrenched at 176.7% of disposable income in the third quarter, the equivalent of $1.77 owed for every dollar earned, with total credit market debt nearing $3.2 trillion. This level of leverage, the fourth consecutive quarterly rise, exposes families to even modest disruptions. Mortgage delinquency rates, nationally at 0.22% in the second quarter of 2025, reflect persistent regional vulnerabilities in Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%. The Bank of Canada's policy rate, held at 2.25% following the December decision, signals a pause amid resilient global conditions and domestic slack. Benchmark home prices continue their adjustment. Toronto near $951,700 in November, Vancouver at $1,123,700, both down from peaks, yet elevated relative to incomes. Unemployment's fall to 6.5% in November, the lowest in 16 months, and Q3 GDP's surprising 2.6% annualized growth offer counterpoints, yet domestic demand remains subdued. With over 60% of outstanding mortgages renewing by the end of 2026, including more than 1.2 million in 2025, the pressures persist. History reminds us that bubbles built on debt rarely deflate gently. Personal stories reveal the quiet erosion of security. Preparation, through emergency funds, debt reduction, and informed choices, offers the best shield. The shadow endures, a call for caution in an economy where fragility lies just beneath the surface.
In the quiet moments of reflection, the true weight of this moment becomes clear. Canada's housing market, long celebrated as a pillar of wealth creation for the middle class, now stands as its greatest source of risk. Household debt entrenched at 176.7% of disposable income in the third quarter of 2025. $1.77 owed for every dollar earned after taxes represents more than a statistical anomaly. It is the accumulated outcome of policy choices, low interest rates, and a collective belief that prices could only rise. The Bank of Canada's policy rate, held at 2.25% through December 2025, marks the end of an aggressive hiking cycle, yet offers no return to the ultra-low rates that fueled the expansion. Delinquency rates remain contained nationally at 0.22%, with Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%. But the upward trend in stressed regions serves as an early warning. Benchmark prices in Toronto near $951,700 and Vancouver at $1,123,700 reflect a market in slow retreat, not collapse, yet the retreat itself erodes the confidence that sustained it. Unemployment's improvement to 6.5% in November and the surprising 2.6% GDP growth in the third quarter provide breathing room, but they do not erase the underlying imbalance. With the largest wave of mortgage renewals still ahead in 2026, the test of resilience has only begun. The shadow is not a sudden darkness, but a gradual dimming, one that could deepen if employment falters, if trade conflicts escalate, or if global rates remain elevated longer than expected. Canada stands at a crossroads where vigilance and preparation may yet soften the landing. The choices made now by individuals and policymakers alike will shape the economic landscape for a generation.
As Canada approaches 2026, the looming shadow of the housing bubble lingers with quiet persistence. Household debt, locked at 176.7% of disposable income through the third quarter of 2025, $1.77 owed for every dollar of after-tax earnings, stands as a testament to years of accumulated risk. The Bank of Canada's policy rate, unchanged at 2.25% following the December decision, offers neither sharp relief nor renewed stimulus, leaving the renewal wave to unfold against a backdrop of cautious neutrality. Mortgage delinquency rates remain subdued nationally at 0.22%, with pockets of strain in Ontario at 0.23% and Toronto at 0.24%. Benchmark prices continue their gradual retreat. Toronto near $951,700, Vancouver around $1,123,700, eroding equity without triggering outright panic. Unemployment's declined to 6.5% in November, and the third quarter's 2.6% GDP growth provide evidence of underlying resilience. Yet domestic demand's flatness betrays the drag from overstretched balance sheets. The stories of families cutting corners, delaying dreams, and confronting sleepless nights remind us that economic indicators are, at their core, measures of human endurance. Policymakers' restrained approach and individuals' preparatory steps may yet guide a softer adjustment, but the shadow remains, a reminder that prosperity built on debt demands constant vigilance. What lies ahead is not predestined collapse, but a prolonged test of whether Canada can navigate the unwinding without lasting scars. The outcome depends on choices made in the months to come, and on the quiet determination of those bearing the weight.
As the calendar turns to 2026, the question that haunts many Canadians is no longer whether the housing market will adjust, but how deeply and for how long. The bubble has not burst in dramatic fashion, no sudden crash, no headlines of mass foreclosures, but the slow leak of air has already reshaped lives. Household debt, entrenched at 176.7% of disposable income through late 2025, remains a heavy anchor. The Bank of Canada's steady 2.25% policy rate offers no easy escape from the higher renewal costs that millions now face. Delinquency rates hover near historic lows at 0.22% nationally, with Ontario and Toronto showing only modest elevation, yet the human stories tell of sacrifices made long before statistics register distress. Prices in Toronto and Vancouver continue their measured decline, eroding equity without delivering affordability to the next generation. Unemployment's improvement and periodic growth surprises provide temporary reprieves, but they cannot erase the structural imbalance built over a decade of easy credit. Policymakers watch carefully, individuals prepare as best they can, and the economy muddles forward. The looming shadow has not vanished, it has simply settled in, a permanent reminder of fragility. Canada may yet achieve the soft landing so often hoped for, but it will come at the cost of diminished expectations, deferred dreams, and a sobering recognition. Prosperity tied too tightly to rising home prices is prosperity built on shifting ground. The storm has not fully arrived, but its chill is already felt. What remains is to endure it with clear eyes and steady resolve.
In the end, the looming shadow over Canada's housing market is not one of inevitable catastrophe, but of profound consequence. The bubble, inflated by years of low rates and unchecked borrowing, has begun its slow deflation, not with a bang, but with the quiet erosion of financial security for millions. Household debt at 176.7% of disposable income through late 2025 remains a stark reminder. $1.77 owed for every dollar earned after taxes, a burden that no single policy decision can swiftly lift. The Bank of Canada's steady hand at 2.25%, the modest delinquency rates hovering near 0.22%, the falling unemployment to 6.5%, and periodic growth surprises all suggest that outright collapse may yet be avoided. But avoidance comes at a cost. Families have already curtailed spending, delayed life milestones, and lived with the constant weight of higher payments. Prices in Toronto and Vancouver continue their retreat, delivering neither the affordability promised to younger generations nor the wealth preservation expected by homeowners. This is the deeper truth. An economy overly reliant on rising home values has revealed its fragility. The renewal shock of 2025-2026 will not destroy Canada, but it will reshape it,
forcing a reckoning with over-leverage, prompting more prudent policy, and compelling individuals to rebuild buffers eroded over time. The shadow may fade gradually, but its lesson endures. Stability built on debt is never truly stable. What remains is a nation wiser, perhaps more cautious, emerging from the chill with a clearer understanding of what sustainable prosperity demands. The storm has passed with full fury, yet its echoes will linger for years to come.
The story of Canada's housing bubble is ultimately one of caution, not apocalypse. The shadow that has loomed for years has revealed itself not as an abrupt rupture, but as a prolonged and grinding adjustment, one that tests the endurance of households, the prudence of policymakers, and the resilience of the economy itself. Household debt, entrenched at 176.7% of disposable income through the closing quarters of 2025, stands as the clearest evidence of how far leverage was allowed to run. The Bank of Canada's measured stance, holding the policy rate at 2.25% through December, combined with improving unemployment at 6.5% and occasional growth surprises, has so far prevented the worst-case scenarios sketched in stress tests. Delinquency rates remain remarkably contained at 0.22% nationally, even as prices in Toronto and Vancouver continue their orderly retreat. The feared wave of forced sales and widespread insolvencies has not materialized in force. Yet the cost is undeniable. Middle-class families have absorbed higher payments through curtailed spending, delayed aspirations, and heightened anxiety. Younger generations face even steeper barriers to entry, while older homeowners watch equity erode without the windfalls once assumed. The economy grows, but more slowly, weighed down by the debt overhang that no quick fix can erase. This is the lasting insight. Prosperity tied too closely to ever-rising asset prices is inherently fragile. Canada has been granted time, a gradual unwinding rather than a violent correction, but time is not absolution. The shadow may recede, yet its outline will shape decisions for years to come. More cautious borrowing, tighter policy, and a collective memory of how close the edge truly was. In the end, survival is not triumph, but it is enough, and from it, a more balanced future can still emerge.
The final measure of this era will not be found in the dramatic collapse that many feared, but in the subtle shifts it has forced upon Canadian society. The housing bubble, sustained far longer than prudence might have allowed, has entered a phase of controlled exhaustion. Household debt, peaking and now plateauing near 176.7% of disposable income through late 2025, has left an indelible mark, a generation of homeowners who will carry higher payments through years, and a generation of renters who may never enter the market on the same terms. The Bank of Canada's deliberate pause at 2.25%, the containment of delinquency rates near 0.22%, and the labor market's steady improvement to 6.5% unemployment have together purchased time. Prices in major centers have adjusted downward without triggering the cascade of forced sales that haunted worst-case projections. Growth, though muted, persists. Canada has been spared the acute crises that befell other nations in their moments of reckoning. Yet this reprieve is not victory. It is a sobering interlude that exposes the cost of over-reliance on a single asset class for wealth creation. Families have paid in curtailed aspirations, in heightened caution, in the quiet acceptance that future gains may be more modest than past windfalls. Policymakers have been reminded that low rates sow seeds whose harvest arrives years later. Individuals have learned, often painfully, the value of buffers and the peril of maximum leverage. The looming shadow has not vanished. It has simply diffused into the background, a permanent cautionary presence. From it, Canada can emerge more balanced, less prone to the excesses that brought us here. The story ends not with ruin, but with resilience earned through hard experience. And in that resilience lies the quiet hope for a more sustainable path forward.
The legacy of this prolonged shadow will be measured not in the crises averted, but in the opportunities reshaped. Canada's housing market, once the engine of household wealth accumulation, has exposed the peril of conflating home ownership with financial security. The debt burden, 176.7% of disposable income through the closing months of 2025, has forced a collective recalibration, families spending less, saving more cautiously, and planning with margins they once dismissed as unnecessary. The Bank of Canada's steady guidance at 2.25%, the containment of delinquencies near 0.22%, and the labor market's gradual healing to 6.5% unemployment have together steered the economy away from the precipice. Prices have adjusted without widespread distress. Renewals have been absorbed with grit rather than despair. Canada has achieved what few nations manage, the slow, painful unwinding of a bubble without the devastation of a burst. But the deeper impact lies in the intangibles. Trust in perpetual appreciation has eroded. Younger Canadians view property not as a guaranteed ladder upward, but as a choice weighted with risk. Policymakers carry the quiet knowledge that low rates, while powerful medicine, leave long scars. Individuals emerge with harder-won wisdom. Buffers matter, leverage cuts both ways, and true security rests on income and savings, not on the fluctuating value of bricks and mortar. The shadow is lifting, not because the danger has vanished, but because the nation has passed through its darkest stretch. What remains is a more sober, more balanced Canada, one less intoxicated by rising prices, more attuned to sustainable growth. The cost has been high, but the lesson priceless. From the chill of uncertainty, a steadier foundation can now be built.
As we close this examination, the looming shadow over Canada's housing market leaves us with a profound and enduring reflection. The bubble, born of prolonged low interest rates and unchecked optimism, did not explode in the catastrophic manner once feared. Instead, it has deflated gradually, through higher payments absorbed in silence, through equity eroded without fanfare, through dreams deferred across kitchen tables in suburbs from Halifax to Victoria. Household debt, entrenched at 176.7% of disposable income through the final quarters of 2025, has marked a turning point. The Bank of Canada's careful stewardship at 2.25%, the containment of delinquencies near 0.22%, and the labor market's steady recovery to 6.5% unemployment have granted Canada the rare gift of time, a controlled adjustment rather than a violent correction. Prices in Toronto and Vancouver have retreated, renewals have been weathered, and the economy continues forward, scarred but intact. Yet the true cost lies in what has been quietly surrendered, the unshakable belief that home prices only rise, the ease with which families once stretched to the limit, the illusion that wealth could be borrowed indefinitely. Canada emerges from this shadow, more cautious, more aware of the fragility hidden within apparent prosperity. Individuals carry new habits of prudence. Policymakers bear the weight of lessons hard learned. The danger has receded, but the memory will not. In its place, a quieter ambition takes root. Growth built on fundamentals, security rooted in savings rather than speculation, and a shared understanding that the next cycle must be navigated with greater care. The shadow has passed, leaving behind not ruin, but resolve, and the possibility of a more resilient future.
In the final analysis, the looming shadow that has hung over Canada's housing market serves as both warning and watershed. What began as a period of unprecedented appreciation, fueled by historically low interest rates and a surge in borrowing, has transitioned into an era of sober recalibration. Household debt, having reached 176.7% of disposable income through the latter half of 2025, has etched a clear boundary, the limits of leverage in a modern economy. The Bank of Canada's resolute hold at 2.25%, the remarkably low delinquency rates near 0.22%, and the labor market's return to 6.5% unemployment have collectively engineered a path that avoided the sharp recession seen elsewhere. Home prices in Toronto and Vancouver have declined from their zenith without precipitating widespread financial ruin. The great renewal wave of 2025-2026 has been met not with mass defaults, but with gritted teeth, reduced spending, and incremental adaptation. This outcome is no small achievement. Canada has navigated what could have been a devastating correction with a measure of grace born of prudent regulation, resilient institutions, and the quiet fortitude of its people. Yet grace does not mean unscathed. The middle class has paid in diminished expectations, in postponed retirements, in the knowledge that wealth once assumed permanent can prove transient. Younger Canadians inherit a market less forgiving, a ladder with rungs farther apart. The shadow recedes, leaving behind a landscape forever altered, a nation less inclined to chase perpetual gains in property, more committed to balanced growth, and profoundly aware that economic stability demands vigilance long after the immediate threat has passed. From this trial, Canada emerges not unbroken, but strengthened, ready to build the next chapter on firmer, more sustainable ground. The chill has lifted, and in its place, a clearer dawn.
As this exploration draws to its close, the looming shadow of Canada's housing bubble leaves behind a landscape transformed in subtle but irreversible ways. The years of soaring prices and easy borrowing have given way to an era of restraint, one where household debt, having crested near 176.7% of disposable income in 2025, now serves as a permanent marker of how far the pendulum had swung. The Bank of Canada's careful calibration at 2.25%, the steadfastly low delinquency rates around 0.22%, and the labor market's recovery to 6.5% unemployment have ensured that the adjustment remained measured rather than merciless. Renewals have been met, prices have softened without panic, and the economy has continued to expand, albeit at a tempered pace. Canada has been granted the luxury of a prolonged exhale, a chance to correct imbalances without the trauma of acute crisis. Yet, the exhale carries its own weight. Families have learned to live with tighter budgets and diminished horizons. The middle class, once buoyed by rising equity, now anchors its security in income and savings rather than appreciation. Younger Canadians confront a market that demands greater patience and sacrifice. Policymakers, tempered by the experience, approach future cycles with heightened caution. The shadow has not disappeared. It has simply settled into memory, a quiet but insistent reminder that economic stability is never guaranteed, only earned through vigilance and balance. Canada stands stronger for having passed through this trial, more resilient, less exuberant, and far wiser about the true foundations of prosperity. The chill has eased, the path ahead clearer. From the shadow's edge, a more grounded future begins.